Okay, so welcome everyone to this event. I think for myself, I'm quite excited. I also studied city and regional planning at UCT almost 10 years ago. And to be honest, I really wish I had an event like this where you could really see previous students' work and, just learn from it and also get some ideas for your own research. So I think it's really a useful event in that sense. And also maybe just for you guys to test your ideas with who's out there and with the young urbanists to get comment and maybe link it to work opportunities. Yeah, because I mean, that's really what the young urbanist is about, like having an open debate, but also really connecting people in a constructive way. So yeah, Mike and Ross and Kiara, you guys have been very generous to present some of your work for us today. I'm really excited to see it. And I think your topics are really nice and diverse. And I think the best way to do it would be for each of you to do a presentation, and then we can have some questions after each presentation relating to that specific topic. And people can pop questions in the chat, or after each presentation, just use the whole raise your hand function. And then I think maybe at the end, it would be nice to have a discussion around just studying at the moment during this whole pandemic phase and being online, and maybe also just finding work and that whole transition, I think, from doing your dissertation to actually moving into the working world. I think that would be an interesting conversation to have. So yeah, Mike, Ross, Kiara, I don't know if you guys have a specific order that you want to go in. I have Kiara first on my list.
We can keep it that way.
Okay. So then after Kiara, I have Max, but he's struggling with Wi-Fi issues, and then Ross, and then Mike. So you guys should be able to share your screens if you want to. If you can't, let me know. But yeah, I'm just going to hand over to Kiara then, and maybe just introduce yourself quickly. And yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Janine. Hi, everyone. So yes, my name is Kiara, and I graduated from UCT at the end of last year. Previously did an honors in environmental studies, and I took some time off, and then I decided I wanted to return and do my master's. And I'm very passionate about cities and seeing an improvement, especially in the city of Cape Town. And so I'm just trying to share my screen at the same time. I went to a film festival, an Encounters Film Festival in 2019, and I watched a documentary that featured Wolwerivier, the settlement in Cape Town, and I just decided I wanted to research it and figure out how it kind of came to be. So I think that's where I can begin.
Great.
Okay, so my dissertation title is A Last Opportunity for Spatial Transformation, Exploring the State's Failures in the Case of Wolwerivier, Cape Town. So Wolwerivier is a relocation settlement located in the city of Cape Town. It's located on the periphery of the city as seen on this map. And such a settlement is typically created in cases of emergency. And in the city of Cape Town, these come in the form of temporary relocation areas or incremental development areas. And the latter, IDAs, are supposed to be a response to the particular failure of TRAs, which were becoming permanent settlements instead of really temporary settlements. So IDAs are expected to be these more sustainable solutions to TRA. And when Wolwerivier was created in 2015, it was considered an IDA. So in 2015, the city of Cape Town relocated informal settlement residents living adjacent to the Vissershoek landfill in the Blouberg district to Wolwerivier. The city also relocated informal settlement residents from smaller settlements in the district, but the larger group came from the landfall site. And so while the city of Cape Town states in its spatial development framework that it is committed to a more inclusive and integrated city, and it aims to address the legacies of apartheid, moving poor Black and coloured households to the periphery recalls the injustices of the apartheid era and reinforces the spatial patterns that were entrenched during that time. So my main research question was, has the city of Cape Town effectively reinstated apartheid-style planning by moving informal settlement residents to Wolwerivier? And then I had 3 supporting subsidiary questions, which I'll show you a bit later on. And this all fed into my research aim, which is to describe the relationship between city policy and planning practice, and to understand how this came to be by considering the extent to which the process of relocation and the established IDA at Wolwerivier reflects apartheid spatial planning. So national lockdown affected the way I intended to perform my research. I realized I could shift from relying primarily on primary research to primary and secondary research, but I think the major change for me was that I could no longer visit Wolwerivier and engage with the residents living there. And while I still managed to answer my research questions, this was a limitation to my research. But yeah, I guess we can jump into my research findings. So my first subsidiary research question was, why did the city purchase such isolated farmland and relocate residents there? And one of the answers I discovered was that in 2012, the city released a spatial development framework that planned for outward growth to occur towards Atlantis. And it was expected for Wolwerivier to eventually be surrounded by development and transport routes. But plans for the city changed when the new spatial development framework for the city was created, which is shown on the right. And Wolwerivier now is situated in this gray area, which is considered the discouraged growth area for the city. And the MSDF failed to account for the impact this would have on the settlement. And all it says in the document is that it recognizes that Wolwerivier is now in this inappropriate location. Is Wolwerivier a sustainable settlement? No, it is not, for numerous reasons. But there's one reason I would like to highlight, which is that Wolwerivier is supposedly this IDA, and it's supposed to be this more sustainable solution to the failures of the TRAs. But local policy documents often confuse these two terms and use them interchangeably. And when in fact these emergency housing models have very different trajectories. And but currently Wolwerivier as an IDA really does not seem so different from a typical TRA that you find in the city. So the concern is that Wolwerivier will remain an unsustainable settlement because it's unlikely to meet the thresholds required for establishing the needed facilities and services in the area. So it's likely to remain an inadequate IDA. How does this choice of land, the act of relocation and resulting settlement contrast with the city's policy of spatial transformation? Well, very simply, Wolwerivier is everything's spatial transformation is really not. And I think the main or the biggest downfall is that following emergency planning, the city prioritized housing provision over spatial restructuring. It needed to quickly move residents from the landfill site, find them new accommodation, and by just prioritizing housing over spatial restructuring, it's in fact exposed poor households to new forms of poverty. So finally, to answer my main research question, has the City of Cape Town effectively reinstated apartheid-style planning? While there are similarities to apartheid-style planning in Wolwerivier's story, in the nature of the way the negotiations would run and in the way the settlement is laid out, I think that it wasn't necessarily reinstating apartheid-style planning, but because that would mean that racial segregation really underpins choices and the decision of moving residents to Wolwerivier. But the city is actually just no longer using relevant and sustainable solutions in the forms of TRAs and IDAs to resettle informal settlement residents when the need arises. So it is possible that Wolwerivier is the result of numerous decisions, which each had its own set of logics. But these logics may have not been inherently bad, but without considering how those decisions fit together, a place like Wolwerivier emerges and represents everything the post-apartheid city should not be. And so because Wolwerivier is a result of a set of failures, I discovered that it represents this disconnect between spatial policy and planning practice. I think I'm a bit over time, but just to end off with some personal reflections. So at the end of my research, I experienced a little bit of frustration because I remain unsure of what Wolwerivier's future is. I could not get in touch with city officials. And I had a lot of unanswered questions about Wolwerivier and its status as an IDA and plans for the site. And lastly, my research did not intend to speak for the residents of Wolwerivier, but rather I intended to draw attention to this settlement that's relatively hidden from society, and just sort of engage in a conversation about how planning can play a role in creating better urban futures. Thank you.
Thanks, Kiara. Wow, I think that's really like very clear and very well structured research. I think it really highlights how these like changing long-term plans have such significant impacts on people's lives, because I actually never realized how that moved towards the Atlantis corridor and then changing it to this turtle thing, really impacted these kinds of decisions. But either way, this decision makes no sense to me, to put something so far away. And I think it's a pity that you couldn't really speak to the residents. Have you been able to visit since or get any kind of interaction? Did you maybe speak to Mfundukwazi or people involved there?
So one of my connections to Wolwerivier is a volunteer who works at the Edu Center there. It's called Sunshine Educare. And they actually moved with the residents from their original informal settlement near the Fisisop landfill to Wolwerivier. So I've been in contact with her, and I've sent my research to her. And then I've also sent my research to the Development Action Group and NU. One of my research participants was someone who was heavily involved in campaigning against moving Woodstock evictees from Woodstock to Wolwerivier, and he used to work for NU. So I had like my connections to all these places, but I still have not engaged with the residents living in Wolwerivier. I spoke to the ward councillor, and yeah, that's kind of where it ended. I think COVID really affected those relationships.
Yeah, definitely.
And maybe there's room to do more research in terms of that.
Yeah, I think that would be amazing. I don't know if anyone else has questions or comments. I think you can just unmute yourself and talk. if not, I was wondering how your research has helped you in employment opportunities. Has it like created this need to work in these kinds of situations, and have you been able to build a network through all those people that you mentioned now?
So it's funny how things work out, but I am working. So I recently got employed at the Western Cape Government in the Policy and Strategy Unit and in the Department of the Premier. And one of the people I interviewed is located in this department. And I think, I don't think that obviously affected hiring me, but I don't know, it's funny the way things play out. I would have liked to have moved specifically into like spatial planning or human settlements, but opportunities were limited when I was looking for work. But I think in some ways, yeah, maybe I'm still so passionate about this, and I hope it will come up in the future for me.
Carl?
Hi, sorry, my internet cut out during the presentation. I'm just not sure if you touched on how the residents have created an sort of a local economy in the area, or does it feed directly? Maybe the nearest employment is Melkbos or Atlantis.
Yeah, so I guess the big change in moving from the landfill to Wolwerivier is that when they lived at the landfill, they were much closer to transport and they could reclaim waste, and there were really so many more opportunities in the initial locations. But when they moved to Wolwerivier, opportunities were limited, and yes, the nearest areas of work are Melkbos or Atlantis, and those distances are far to travel and it's expensive. So what's tended to happen is there's an informal economy occurring in Wolwerivier now, where they, backyard shacks are being set up, and informal renting is occurring. So and informal selling of the units. So it's kind of, yeah, it really is just was not a sustainable solution. And so what actually has ended up happening is that, one unit was made for a family of 4. They've now moved in maybe with their neighbors, and there's extreme overcrowding in one unit just to rent out the other units. So like I said, again, this isn't coming from a direct source, but it's coming from people who volunteer in the neighborhood or from the ward councillor.
Hi, Kiara. Just a follow-up question on what you just said, with kind of overcrowding happening. Did you hear stories or kind of find evidence of people coming here from other areas? Yeah, I just want to know more about how that overcrowding is happening, why it's happening.
Yeah, it's actually funny. During my scoping exercise, I met someone who had just moved into Wolwerivier from, it was like Pinelands, and it really struck me. It's very interesting, why would someone want to move to such an isolated site? But I think there's such a demand for affordable housing, and this is what people, I guess, are willing to do. But I think the overcrowding is also really based on the fact that these IDAs don't accommodate for growing families. So when families originally moved in, they might have had a child who was, 18, who's now 25, and is having a child of their own. And there's, formally, you're not meant to sell these units. They're owned by the city. And that's also a problem with these incremental development areas, because they supposedly should offer some sort of tenure and security, but that handover process isn't happening. So that's what I was saying. There's this confusing, and yeah, there's this confusion between IDAs and TRAs. It's quite problematic. And Wolwerivier is really not standing out to be this incremental development area. It's really just another TRA.
Yeah, I mean, I think this research is really interesting. The last time I kind of engaged in this was 4 or 5 years ago when I was in Cape Town, and hearing from people at NU that kind of said that the main forms of economy was essentially like taxi drivers taking people in from the site and prostitution. And there were so few other kind of ways to make money in the area back then. I don't know, it's probably changed now, but I mean, I think in this, in studying the site, there's almost 2 scales of research. There's the kind of local economy, what's happening on the ground, how people are faring within this. And then there's, I think, maybe what you engaged in more, which is the spatial planning research, which is basically how did this happen from the city point of view, and they're almost 2 separate, each one its own thesis. Yeah, so it's really interesting.
I think you summed it up really well there.
Yeah, maybe the social aspect can be your PhD one day.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. Thanks so much, Kiara, and thanks, guys, for your questions. I think let's move on to Ross. Hi.
Hi there. Sorry, just unmuting myself. Yeah, I just want to say thanks to Kiara for presenting. We were actually in different rounds, so it was so nice to see a taste of what Kiara actually got to present with the pandemic. We just had different phases.
Oh yeah, that's another benefit.
Yeah, it's quite awesome to see that. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to see my share screen. Can y'all see my screen?
So you're taking us to Windhoek. Are you currently based there, or?
To Windhoek?
Oh, no, that's Max. Okay,
yeah.
sorry, I'm mixing it up. Are you in Cape Town?
Yeah, mine is Cape Town.
Okay.
But sorry, let me introduce myself. Hi, I'm Ross Train. I'm also a Master of City and Regional Planning graduate from UCT last year, same as Kiara. And this year, so I graduated from the MCRP program, and I took a little bit of a different route to planning, and I've gone into the renewable energy industry. So I'm working as part of a project development team. Much like Kiara, so I have an environmental and geographical science undergraduate, so passionate about the environment. And that's how my journey filtered through into planning. So yeah, I'm still Cape Town based and hoping to stay here for quite a while. So yeah, cool. I'll kick off into the presentation.
Thanks.
Cool. I just want to see if I can minimize this on the side. Because it's like, okay, no, it's fine. So the title of my dissertation, it's a bit of a mouthful, but so it was titled The Municipal Flow, the role of spatial planning in contributing towards the construction of a water-sensitive city and promulgating the development of a water-sensitive urban design framework for the city of Cape Town. So looking at the research aim and the scope of it was confined to the municipal boundary of the city of Cape Town. And I basically looked at the role of spatial planning in accommodating healthy urban hydrological systems within the city of Cape Town, as well as analyzing contemporary water management paradigms. And this was basically carried out in hopes to encourage the further integration of water-sensitive urban design within the city and the city's municipal spatial development framework. Just some general limitations that I encountered throughout my research process. So the first one was the time constraint, given that we only had 5 or 6 months, which then informed a smaller scope that would be preferable, as well as the fact that the research was conducted during COVID-19. A byproduct of this was that the city of Cape Town was unavailable for interviews. And as a byproduct of having a smaller scope than I'd hoped, with it just being the city of Cape Town, there's limited generality of the intervention that I proposed within the MSDF. And water-sensitive urban design is also a relatively new approach in terms of water management and urban planning, as well as a northern approach. So there's not as much research in the south. So looking at water sensitive urban design and defining it, the Australian government basically states that it is the integration of urban planning with the management, protection and conservation of urban water management, and ensuring that water management and planning is sensitive to hydrological and ecological processes. In this, the role of spatial planning within water-sensitive urban design, given that it's a multi-faceted and rather interdisciplinary interdisciplinary way of developing, the role of spatial planning within this is not only to value water and consider the local context, the positives and the negatives of a specific site, but perceiving all aspects of the water cycle as valuable, be it potable or non-potable. Furthermore, the emphasis on accountability for spatial planners remains for the spatial landscape development and the natural landscapes that they're developing upon, and thereby the natural ecosystems in which they affect. So as I said, I was looking at the MSDF. So diving into that, I looked at water systems and how this is represented within the MSDF. And the first thing that became very apparent was that water was very fragmented and separated. So here you can see that we have groundwater, rivers, and wetlands, which are all separated across 3 different maps. Additionally, we also see that groundwater in the MSDF is not accurately represented, as we have the MSDF on the left, and on the right you have the bioregional plan, which was also published by the City of Cape Town, but the bioregional plan shows the quality as well as the quantity of water underground beneath the city. Looking at the MSDF strategies, there are 3, and the second one typically makes reference to water. In this, it's typically looking to manage urban growth whilst creating a balance between environmental protection and development. And you can see that it targets, there's obligations to mitigate negative impacts of development, as well as make more efficient use of non-renewable resources, and considering the impact of development in influencing natural systems. We see that the term water-sensitive urban design was actually found in the MSDF, despite it being a very northern concept and a new approach. However, it was only found to be in the 260-odd page document twice, and the first mention was under Policy 24, just making reference to water-sensitive urban design principles. Otherwise, it was just defined within the glossary. During the literature review and contextual analysis, it became apparent that there were many opportunities for water-sensitive urban design throughout the city. And very broadly, these relate to strengthening stormwater drainage management and regulation, as well as enhancing the amenity of the city and its water systems. There's potential to reduce temperatures in summertime, as well as emphasize water-sensitive development, as well as reform the way in which water is referred to within development. Often we see that planners speak about protecting water away from development as opposed to developing with natural and ecological systems. We also see great potential in terms of water-sensitive urban design for encompassing communities in this process and decentralizing planned water management, as well as moving away from working in silos and strengthening interdisciplinarity. Sorry, it's always a tongue twister for me. Interdisciplinarity, there you go. We see that the city itself faces constraints for implementing water-sensitive urban design. However, as the city relies on external water sourcing, predominantly outside the municipality and from rainfall, water-sensitive urban design philosophies remain underemphasized. The water network representation is fragmented, and water is often protected away from development. We need solutions which can be both practical and affordable for both formal and informal areas, and community involvement is needed, something which is always assumed, but not always do communities want to actually take on the responsibility or the accountability of projects like water-sensitive urban design. So my approach then was basically to create a water-sensitive spatial plan for the city of Cape Town, and this looked at promoting integration and interdisciplinarity, as well as changing the language within the MSDF to develop with water systems as opposed to away from them, and emphasize the value that ecological infrastructures can play for a city. So just very broadly, sorry, I'm cutting out a lot of things here. So very broadly, the first thing that I did was combine wetlands and rivers, so our surface water maps, onto one map. And then I don't know if you guys can see my mouse here, but on the map on the right, there's a blue, you see blue lines, and that was basically the blue network flows, which were buffers along our central river systems throughout the city. So kind of to create more space for our water systems, as well as the yellow dots, which you see, which are sites of either degraded or threatened water systems. Additionally, I then added not only our water quantity for underground water, but the water quality within the MSDF, which informed identifying our degraded sites throughout the city. And then that moved on to the spatial strategy too. So this is quite text heavy, but my proposal was basically in blue. And the proposal here was basically to, again, develop with water. So emphasizing that shift from protecting water away from development and always protecting the natural landscape to rather saying, let's use ecological infrastructures and build with it and become intertwined. And then using spatial strategy to again reference policy 24, which spoke to water sensitive urban design, as well as my own suggestion of putting in a special case scenario, which I will get onto next after the spatial policy 24. So spatial policy 24, this basically was just saying to reduce the impact of harmful urban developments, as well as bring light to the blue network flows, which were the buffers, and the blue network nodes within the maps. So just increase our visibility of maps so it becomes a visual stimulus for planners, as well as, again, emphasizing the special case scenario, which is the next thing. So the special case scenario was a way that I kind of created to just not create a generic application, but a more standard and easier practice for water sensitive urban design throughout the city of Cape Town. And what this did was it took applications of water sensitive urban design all across the world. And you see on the left, we have potable water management strategies. So say, for example, water sensitive tech installations, the first one, and it shows you where it would be most applicable in terms of development type and scale. So we can see that it's not applicable in street and parking areas, but it would be for residential community or apartment block. So it kind of, I wouldn't say it's something that developers can swear by, but it's an easier way for a way to decentralize water sensitive urban design. If you're not someone who's within the city trying to develop, then you can also kind of see where you can accommodate water sensitive urban design into your own, be it your household development or whatever kind of space that you have. And then this is just the same kind of concept, just again, we have our water management strategies, and then you have the operations service being the objectives that were contained within the water sensitive spatial plan. So are you looking to target increased water quality, quantity? Do you want better water supply? Are you looking to treat your wastewater? So yeah, that was just like a quick guide for kind of looking what type of water sensitive urban design would be most applicable to the type of development that either the city or a developer or a private homeowner would be doing. And then, yeah, my findings throughout my research basically saw that the city is targeting densification, and historically, this is observed to have negative effects on the urban hydrological cycle. We see also great inequities in terms of our water resource distribution throughout the city. The city lacks secured large-scale alternative water sources, and in this, water-sensitive urban design was also attempting to achieve secured underground water source, because the city is looking to, I think it's desalination, treated wastewater and underground, but it hasn't secured any of those yet. And securing groundwater is potentially the easiest and the cheapest for the city. So water sensitive urban design is a way to contribute towards that. And then we also see that water sensitive urban design philosophies exist within the MSDF, but they are limited. A lot of the language concerning water speaks to protect water away from it. It's a very kind of segregative terminology that's used. We see that water is commodified, it's objectified, it's used for financial purposes, but it's never a part of the city. You always kind of think of conservation, and then you think of the city instead of thinking the city and the conservation are one. We see that there's room to emphasize water sensitive urban design approaches in the city and the MSDF. And furthermore, that water sensitive development can aid in decentralizing water system development and management, as well as securing these water sensitive alternative water supplies. Sorry. Yeah, that is me.
Wow, Ross, that is very impressive. You basically wrote a whole policy, which I think is actually very, very useful and insightful, and hopefully something that can be taken forward. I think for me, it really emphasizes this juncture between engineering and the way that engineers plan and the way that planners and urban designers think. And I mean, my father is actually a water engineer and I'm a planner, and we're constantly fighting about these kinds of things, you know, who needs to follow who, and engineers always have this very technical answer to these kinds of questions. But yeah, it's interesting to see that urban design can actually play a bigger role in more sustainable water, you know, management. But yeah, I was also wondering, because so I'm based in the Netherlands, and I actually worked for an urban design company here who did all their work based on water sensitive design, which obviously in the Netherlands is quite a big industry. You know, everything has to work with the water. But in South Africa, it's maybe not so prominent. And one of the projects that they worked on was actually the River Club. The developers asked them to give some input into that. And I also saw on the Young Urbanist page this week about the Amazon proposals. And yeah, did you think about like specific projects and how that impacts on the city's decisions about these things in kind of water sensitive areas? Maybe those yellow circles that you identified, one of them looked like the River Club.
So yeah, initially I was hoping to drop down to quite a lower scale, but my supervisor, and rightly so, told me rather, so the maps were created at a conceptual level, and she was saying like, if you want to go drop down, that should be more PhD, because we only had 5-6 months. So for myself, there were definitely areas which I personally would have loved to target, but ultimately it came down to working with combining surface water networks and underground water networks. And I think the main informant was creating a way for water sensitive urban design to create an alternative water supply for groundwater. So a lot of it was targeted where there was poor groundwater quality sites, as well as also just looking at general pockets of water and seeing which areas have the most accessibility to water, as well as also looking at, for example, I was looking at areas which were mechanized. So looking, for example, if you have a canal, then you've got an area which you've completely disturbed the ecology, and you've just got this concrete and you've got a lack of infiltration now. So it was more looking at it from where do we have the most built up areas that we can apply water sensitive urban design to integrate ecology within those spaces, as well as looking at where are the poorest groundwater quality sites that we can fix that, create better quality, so that the next time we go through a drought, we don't actually have to worry about relying on rainfall, and we can instead rely on groundwater as well. So that was kind of the basis of my choices, as opposed to zooming in quite specifically, because that would have taken significantly more time.
No, I can imagine. It makes sense to look at it from a more regional strategic perspective. Muhammad, you have quite a good question. Do you maybe want to just ask it yourself?
Thanks for the opportunity, Janine. I always like to hear myself speak, but anyway. Yeah, great presentation, Ross. Just a question, which I'll just regurgitate from the chat. Yeah, why do you say in your last slide that densification negatively influences the water cycle? Because in a previous slide, you did say that for your policy considerations, your policy recommendations, you are calling for high density development along with BRT. And yeah, just from a very uninformed perspective, I'd say that that densification would have fewer impacts on water resources and the water cycle. So yeah, that's just basically my question.
Yeah, I hear your question. It was also a bit of a conflict that I had with my supervisor at the end. But so the reason that I say the city targets densification, which is observed to be which has been observed to have a negative influence on the water cycle, is it's more been from the historic point of view of developing a city itself. So I think it's in this context, it's not so much the grouping of densification as it was the building of cities, because cities create impermeable spaces, and that in itself disrupts the hydrological cycle. So much of the literature review, when I was doing that research, a lot of it, what came through was engineers and planners were basically just trying to create a space where people could live, but reduce flood risks. So cities were historically built to be impermeable, and that became an issue for groundwater filtration. And that's what I mean when I say the densification of a city negatively influences the water cycle, because it disrupts that process of the water going back into the ground and feeding into the cycle all over again. And so, yeah, so for me, one of the targets was ironically densification. I mean, I feel like it's an unavoidable fact of life, but it's the way that you go about the densification. So for example, water-sensitive urban design, the way that we construct our roads, the materials that we use, because you have permeable paving and you have impermeable paving, the spaces that you give as a buffer from the city. So for example, canalizing a river decreases that impermeability of water into the ground. The surrounding space of a riverbank, depending whether or not you're going to build roads or houses nearby, creating an extended buffer creates more natural space. And in that you have room for water to filter back into the ground and fill up the water table. So that's why I'm saying when historically cities are constructed and they create this impermeable space, you can't get through it. I'm not necessarily saying that densification in itself is the problem. It's just saying that historically densification caused this problem, but they were using different practices and different techniques. So the way to go forward is basically, my opinion would be still targeting densification, but just finding a way through water-sensitive urban design practices which use more ecological infrastructure as well as more permeable structure than has historically been used, if that answered your question.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Ross. That does answer my question. I think I was just a bit confused in the sense that when people talk about densification, they generally mean densification of previously brownfield sites, if you could say. So areas that have been zoned for single family houses and are already do already have these impermeable surfaces that are just upzoned or densified, which maybe you can shed some light on this. Would that still have a very negative impact on the water cycle and water resources, or in the on the level of sprawling low density developments on the urban edge, such as Wolwerivier that Kiara talked about? Thanks.
I hear you. Okay, so let me put it like this. Densification isn't necessarily the problem. I mean, development's going to happen one way or another. We're just seeing that statement in itself, the city targeting densification, which has historically been observed to negatively influence the cycle. That's saying the practice of development, the way that it was done. It's not densification itself, because whether or not you have an apartment block or you have a house on a site of land is irrelevant. You're still occupying the site of land, you've still created that urban space and you're developing. The issue comes in the manner in which you develop. So for example, do you have grey water installations? Do you have a green roof? Like whether it be that's on an apartment block or whether it's on a house, are you still retaining water via a green roof? Is it a way for you to mitigate flooding? The surrounding area of your apartment block or your house, do you have space for infiltration? Do you have bioretention ponds within your neighborhood? So it's not necessarily a means of saying that development is bad and development is going to negatively influence the urban hydrological cycle. It's just saying that before we didn't necessarily have these practices or have a way to understand the way in which they worked, whereas now we do. So it's more just saying that densification is going to happen. The city is targeting it. We just want to make sure that it's not going to happen the way that it's previously been happening.
All right. Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate it.
Hi, Ross.
Hi.
Thank you for the presentation. That was really interesting. Just something to add on that last point about densification, and this is something that actually Janine and I spoke about, where when you have these developments and you want to implement all these great sustainable water systems within your development, it's incredibly difficult to do it if your site is not being developed densely. So you almost need the kind of finance that comes with a higher density development in order to pay for all of these really nice things that we need, but that, for example, an individual household might not want to or would not be able to pay for and finance.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. And so a way that I also kind of slipped it in, so I hear what you're saying regarding at a singular level where you've got like a household. But that's why I was saying, so the special case scenario, the scales of development was a way to include people, so decentralization, a way to include people in the decision. So if you want to incorporate it within your space, you can. But I think one of the main selling points that I used throughout the dissertation was what a sense of urban design can be used for large developments, upcoming developments. And a way that this can be done is to give almost like a special permit. So like with the EIAs, sorry, I'm trying to think of the word now. So when you apply for an EIA, you've always got to show that you're going to mitigate the negative impacts of a development in order to get your environmental authorization. And basically saying that the city can use water sensitive urban design as a way to not bypass the environmental authorization, but just kind of like speed it up and make a development more attractive. Whether or not your development gets approved at the end of the day is still up to the city, but it's just a way that a developer can boost their chances in getting an environmental authorization. And yeah, just kind of like also to help assist taking the central pressures and the obligations off the city of Cape Town, having to do it all by themselves. So in terms of a homeowner, I mean, I think unless it comes to, for instance, where you have the 2015 to 2017 drought and people start employing their own grey water tanks, like there's no need for them to do it otherwise, but still to give them an option to say it's in the MSDF. And we've created a quick guide for you if you're still building an extension onto your house, or you're creating a house on its own, or you want to be ecologically sensitive, you have these options. There is a way, as opposed to you saying, I want to be ecologically sensitive and friendly, but I have no idea where to start. I wouldn't know what practice to use or what would work within the development of my scenario. So I completely hear your point, and I share it as well, where it's tough for a homeowner to kind of adopt it because it's more costly. But I think it's also more about just creating that accessibility, because a lot of the time we also see within planning, as planners, we can read it, but I think beyond planning, it's quite inaccessible, because I myself sometimes still struggle reading planning documents. So it's just a way of creating accessibility. If you want to include it in your space, you can, and just to provide that option to people.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think especially in these larger scale developments, it's almost like creating an incentive, like you're saying, Ross, you know, so that the city doesn't have to impose these things on people afterwards, but that developers actually just creatively work with what should be done in an incentive way. And like an example is this project in Cape Town that one of my colleagues are working on. And at the end of the project, the city, it's a huge site. It's like 500 hectares. And at the end, the city came and said, okay, but actually you need all these retention ponds. And now all of a sudden it like takes up so much space, and there's no creative way of making them, you know, recreational or active or usable. And yeah, so I think it's just about like initiating that kind of creativity from the beginning when it comes to these water
And
issues.
I think in Taka Island is a good example for within Cape Town. In
What was the
Taka
name?
Island at Century City, that's their retention pond, and they turned it into a kind of recreational area that you can go and visit.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Super interesting, Ross. I think we can talk about this for a very long time. It's such an important issue, especially in Cape Town. And is there any other like burning questions? Maybe we can come back to it after Mike's presentation. Yeah, okay, let's maybe come back to it if someone wants to bring something up. Ross, thank you so much. It was really, really interesting.
Thanks for having me. Good luck, Mike. Stop share. Yeah.
Cool.
So Mike's taking us to the pandemic
Yeah,
as a topic.
back to COVID. Cool. How's it, guys? My name is Mike Hathorn. I also graduated with Ross and Kiara from UCT's Masters in City and Planning at the end of last year. My dissertation topic, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. My dissertation topic was planning for health and well-being, reflections on urban policy and practice in the city of Cape Town and the Western Cape province during the COVID-19 pandemic. And my main research problem, there were other sub-questions, but it was how can governmental responses to the COVID-19 pandemic provide lessons for urban policy and practice in the city and province. And I framed this question using the social determinants of health, which is the environment in which people live and work. And there's been a lot of research in the last sort of 20, 30 years to discuss how those have a profound effect on health at a population level. And so inequalities in the environment and inequalities in the built environment in particular lead to inequity in health outcomes. And so there's been, and so I looked at the historical link between planning and public health, which was quite interesting. And in South Africa, our first town planning law was actually part of the National Public Health Bill that came out just after the Spanish flu. And that law was kind of used for health, but essentially what it amounted to is a justification for slum eradication in the interests of promoting clean and hygienic and healthy settlements. And so I wanted to look at how there was this historical link that wasn't always necessarily positive, and then the two disciplines kind of drifted apart over the course of the 20th century as health moved towards more of a biomedical model of treating individuals with drugs, and planning kind of focused on spatial issues. And I wanted to see whether COVID-19 would cause a sort of a crisis point that brought health more front and center for the planning discipline. And so given the audience that we have here and that a lot of you guys are current UCT students, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the methods that I used. Sorry, there's a bike outside my window. And what it was like doing research in during COVID, during a time of varying degrees of lockdown, and also tackling a research question that was initially meant to focus on the city of Cape Town, and I later broadened it because it was, as Ross and Kiara have touched on, it's hard to contact, well, not hard to contact officials from the city, but it's hard to get permission to do research with officials from the city of Cape Town. I'll just describe briefly the process that I went through. So you have to submit a research request if you want to speak on the record to city officials. And if you want to speak to people from the Department of Health, you have to submit a separate research request to them. So I submitted both of those in, I think, beginning of July last year, with the intention of interviewing people through August. And the health research request was processed relatively quickly, and I could do interviews based off that. I think in September. But the general research request had some initial correspondence with someone, and I was thought I'd be able to do interviews in August, September, but then had total radio silence. And while that was going on, I'd kind of reached out informally to a few people just to ask if they would be open to being interviewed once the research request was approved. And one of those people responded just by sending me a calendar invite for the interview. And so I said, okay, well, can we do the interview just on condition that if I do get the research request approved, then I can use it, and if that doesn't happen, then I won't use it. And this person said, sure, that was great. And then I was following up with the person who I had been in contact with, kind of subsequently month after month, and just not getting any response. And then eventually our dissertations were due on the 15th of January. On the 23rd of December, I got an email saying that my research request had been approved. And so I wrote back saying, okay, well, I've got this one interview that I did way back when on condition that if I get approval, I can use it. Can I just get approval for this interview? And they said yes. And so because of that, I was able to work those findings into my dissertation. But I just wanted to just lay that out for current students, because I think it's an important consideration if you're considering a research question with the city, is that it's not a guarantee that you will be able to speak to the people who you need to speak to. So if you are considering that sort of research question, my advice would be to have a backup plan and have people who maybe used to work at the city, or from other spheres of government, or other sectors of society who can comment on the question. But yeah, so that's that. And then I thought I'd just describe the methods that I used a little bit. So I in addition to interviews, I looked at some of South Africa's main policy documents and how health and planning are prioritized and put next to each other at a kind of cascading scales. And so I found the NDP really interesting in that regard, because the chapter on health is very big on the social determinants of health, and includes a section talking about how planners need to ensure that we have healthy environments. But then the chapter on human settlements and spatial transformation is completely silent on health. So there's a kind of dissonance there that also appears as you drop down through the scale. So the PSDF and Cape Metro healthcare strategy, they're kind of aligned on health. The MSDF barely mentions health for the city of Cape Town. I think it's like a 250-page document, and I did a word search, and health is mentioned, I think, fewer than 20 times. And the IDP is does talk a lot about health, but it's quite focused on facilities planning. So building new clinics and hospitals, and ensuring that infrastructure is maintained. And then, yeah, so I'm not gonna talk about my findings directly. I'll in the interests of time, talk about my analysis instead, because that kind of works in the findings. But with the question of how has COVID-19 shifted planning goals in the city and province, I mean, when I was doing my research, it was kind of in the eye of the storm, which I think was definitely a weakness of this project. And so it was too early to say definitively, but there was, like, within the human settlement space, there was a focus on informal settlement upgrading rather than building top structures. Kind of, I think it was the momentum for that was building before COVID-19, but it was interesting to hear people talking about that. And a lot of people from Beast focused on intersectoral collaboration and connection with health. And although this wasn't uniform or consistent, it was kind of like depending on the person and what sort of relationships they had, that varied. But there was a very strong sentiment coming throughout from the people who I spoke to of, you know, we're in this together, we need each other, and people were willing to work across sectors and across to kind of break out of silos in a way that they hadn't been previously. And in terms of what it meant for how health and well-being in particular were prioritized in planning, policy, and practice, it did. I think what the literature on the social determinants of health and how those can be spatialized reaffirms is just the first principles of planning. You know, if you have a settlement that performs well in terms of, like, say, the Splumer principles, or according to, you know, what the new urban agenda says, like it'll be a healthy settlement, and the social determinants of health will be addressed. And I think what that says to me is that we need to think critically about the international literature and what's achievable in South Africa. A lot of the international literature on the social determinants of health and urban health talks about how, you know, collaboration in terms of developing new infrastructure is insufficient or inadequate. And in South Africa, that's actually that's a really complex question, especially in our, you know, cities where land is scarce, and finding viable sites for clinics and for hospitals is a really complex, really fraught task. And so I think there is a need to focus collaboration there, and I think that is happening a lot within government. But it's not something that can kind of be dismissed in the way that it is in some of the international literature. And opportunities, yeah, there was a kind of sense at the time that this might present an opportunity to work with informality in new ways. There was a lot of people spoke about how information was shared more freely between sectors and departments of government as a result of COVID-19, and that I think is positive, especially because health information can be very important for understanding the needs of a settlement or a population. And you know, there was a sense, although this was quite vague, that you know, we could use the focus on health and the sort of spatial disparities and how, especially the first wave of COVID-19 manifested, that it could be used as a point of leverage to address the issues around spatial inequality that we all know about. But with all of that, budget constraints were and still are a serious issue. Grants were being cut, and rate spaces were diminishing. And yeah, so it's there's stuff we need to do, but the resources with which to do it are becoming scarcer and scarcer. And yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Mike. I think it's useful for the way you talked about your methodology, because I think the experience that you had with engaging with officials potentially, you know, reflects how it is actually professionally as well, to get information from people when it's not urgent from their side. But, you know, that open communication stream is so important. But yeah, it's really something to consider when doing research. And yeah, but I think your presentation really made me think about, like, just reframing spatial planning based on the the basic principles, like you were saying, like health should be the basic principle. And I actually started reading this book recently called Palaces for the People, where this guy explains how in Chicago there was this massive heat wave, and two communities, similar demographics, similar density and all those things had a very different response in terms of death rates. And it wasn't because of the way that people responded physically to the heat, but it was because people were lonely, and no one knew that they were suffering alone and they couldn't, get help, and that really is about social infrastructure, like where's your nearest person that you can contact, and do people know where you are, and the people you see every day, when last did they see you, and those are the things I think that planners must really think about, although it's quite difficult. But yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting topic, and it's almost, like you say, it almost needs to happen now again, and it will probably change quite a lot. And globally, it's been a big topic, so it will be interesting to see how Cape Town interprets it. I don't know if anyone has specific questions for Mike. I think people, Azra.
I have a question. In your research, did you find examples from the city of Cape Town or from around the world for how these policies are implemented as maybe some kind of inspiration for Cape Town?
You mean in terms of healthy cities?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the city actually had a healthy cities program a little while back, I believe, and one of the people who I spoke to used to work at the city, and he was part of that. But the issue with all of this, I think, kind of comes down to mandate, and it's the general issue with something like the social determinants of health is that the Department of Health has its mandate, and that's to treat patients, and then spatial planning has its mandate, and that's to focus on how the city is developing, and so there's this gap that opens up in between, but I don't think Cape Town's a very healthy city at the moment, and there's a need for more research into urban health in the city of Cape Town, and how it can be, what sort of interventions we need in order to make it a healthier space.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to find a good example, because it's almost something that maybe will emerge now with COVID. It's like people need a crisis before they really start responding physically.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the things that make a healthy settlement, or the things we all know. You need green space. It needs to be walkable. You need access to employment and access to shops. There needs to be a good public transport system. I mean, the most significant social determinant of health is how the population performs economically, and the kind of most detrimental aspect of the built environment to population health is high levels of segregation, because that creates all sorts of inequities that damage population health, and also like the presence of fast food outlets close to schools and close to where people live is also a negative. And I mean, I don't think that's necessarily considered all that. I don't think that sort of thing is a consideration with land use approvals in the city at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always see this emerging or adding on to the, I think it's called the CSIS.
CSIR.
CSIR, that one. Although it is more quantitative as opposed to qualitative, but kind of metric that says once you have these things within a city or within a neighborhood, then you could probably hope, I mean, more assessments could be done to see if these things come together, you are creating a healthy city. That's,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
the only-
definitely.
Yeah, like indicators.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. There was a study using secondary information, mainly census data, to kind of develop proxy indicators for the social determinants of health in the city. But I mean, it's also stuff like air quality. And so yeah, it is measurable. It's just you know, good spatial data in South Africa is quite hard to come by. Yeah,
I think it's interesting because all three you guys, your presentations talk about just reframing planning. You know, it's already there, the indicators and the ideas, and it's just like how we think about it and how we approach it. Muhammad, question, comment?
Yeah, I do. Great presentation, Mike. And before I ask my question, I just want to say that I do apologize for speaking about densification so much. But anyway, Mike, did you touch on like during COVID, there was this entire trend of cities wanting to de-densify and like in the context of informal settlements and that there?
yeah, I mean, so I think the thing that came out of that quite quickly during COVID was that density isn't necessarily the problem, but crowding is. You know, a dense urban settlement that has, you know, access to outdoor space and facilities and the other things you need in order to have a good life is not that's not problematic from a health perspective. But if you have a settlement with high levels of crowding, then that obviously is. And then the big thorny policy issue in South Africa that came out of that during COVID was the National Minister of Human Settlements declaration that there was going to be de-densification in a whole lot of informal settlements across the country, and the kind of the outcry that followed in response to that, and then the effect that had on other spheres of government as well, because people at the province and at the city had no warning about that announcement. And so it was quite interesting to hear about how officials responded to that and kind of tried to use it as a way to fast track existing programs in those spaces for like to move people out and get improved services in. But yeah, I mean, I think aside from that initial statement that was then walked back quite quickly around de-densification, it wasn't like people were saying, oh no, we need to stop densifying. I think that sort of narrative got squashed quite quickly.
Yeah, I think it's, for me, what you're telling now is so interesting about how politicians, or how COVID actually exposed how inconsistent politicians are, and how their decisions are really just based on, you know, who knows what. But maybe just to move towards, you know, talking about your experience and the fact that there's other students here. Do students have specific questions about like this current form of studying and doing research? And like, I'm actually also at the moment studying, but I'm also teaching. So it's an interesting experience for me to be on both sides of the screen. And my research is also not based on a place where I am at the moment. So it's a lot of like Google Street viewing and things like that, which I personally find is useful, because Azra will also be able to say, you often work in a place that's not where you are, you have
Different
to
continent.
literally, exactly, and trying to do research about a place that you don't even know. And I think this has really forced us to be able to do that. And I think maybe people are more open to like online interviews and things like that. But then it's also that, missing of networking when you're studying and connecting with people. Do you have any tips, like Kiara and Ross and Mike, on how you manage with that? And I don't know, some ideas or even just questions from the crowd?
Yeah, I can speak to that, but I think first let's see if anyone has any questions.
Yeah. Everyone's very quiet. It doesn't seem like there's specific questions.
Yeah.
I'm wondering from the group here if they've submitted anyone's in their master's year right now, and if they've submitted their ethics forms, because that's something we had to navigate at the beginning of COVID. But I don't know if anyone's.
Why was it
around.
was it a particular issue?
Yeah, well, I think we just had to submit our ethic forms when things were like very uncertain. And it was like level 5 lockdown. So we didn't know what the year would hold. And so we basically, a lot of us had written our applications already. So it seemed like quite a task to almost rewrite it. So we ended up attaching a risk register as like an appendix to our applications, and that was really useful. So it offered like a little bit of flexibility in terms of like your research methods. Yeah, so I thought that was really useful, but I'm sure the lecturers shared that with the students.
Any other experiences that you think is worth
Yeah,
mentioning?
I'd just say that oh, sorry, go ahead, Ross.
No, go, do you? Okay. I was just basically going to say, also just building off what Kiara was saying, with ethics approval, I think all of us can like resonate with the fact that the city took forever to respond. I know I got my approval while I was in my external examination. Kiara got hers a little bit after as well. So it's a bit of a wild ride. So I think maybe just check with your supervisor what the exact process will be. But like as soon as you get your ethics approval, I would definitely, if you're planning to interview the city, shoot that email across. And for those of you that are also planning to interview the city, treat it like it's a job. The one mistake that I did was I treated it like I was a student, where it was almost like my relationship with my lecturers, where I didn't kind of, like, you don't cross a boundary, like you're not colleagues. It's kind of just like someone else is a mentor to you, they're superior, you're there to listen, gather information, ask questions later. When it comes to the city, hound them. Send the emails, even if it means you got to send like 15 emails, call people if you have to, because in the end, it'll be worth it once you get your interviews from them. But if you just kind of send one email and you sit back and you wait it out, nothing's going to come from that. And in the end, you're kind of going to have to plan last minute to just go forward without your interviews. So I think my personal best advice, once you've got your ethical approval, just shoot straight through to the city of Cape Town and don't stop hounding them. Every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, just keep checking in saying, have you seen my email? Is this being processed? Have the right people heard like what I'm requesting? Until somebody responds to you, because otherwise they get back to you and they're like, do you still need to have an interview? And you're sitting there like, okay, well, I'm busy having my glass of wine. Like, I'm finished my presentation, it's submitted. Like, what must I do with this? So yeah.
And all your interactions with the city for the rest of your life will be like that. So
Exactly.
practice.
Yeah, and I think it's also maybe an opportunity to be critical and to critique them, because, maybe when you're working with the city in the future and hounding them, they might be your clients, but in this case, you can treat them as equal and still critique them without losing your job. But that's really good advice, Ross. Mike, I think your sound went off. Carl, do you have a question?
I just want to know, I'm struggling to figure out, I'm still working on my research question. Does the ethics application require that I know what my questions are going to be and who I'm going to interview before I even, as I submit my ethics application, because that needs to go in, but I'm not quite sure on what exactly my research question is.
No,
So that's kind of where I'm struggling at the moment. Like, I want to submit the ethics application, but I don't want to put it in black and white, and I can't change or flex or maneuver as I unpack things.
so you should have an idea of what your research question is, although it can change. And you just need to give a description of the types of people you want to interview, and then like a broad overview of the sorts of questions that you want to ask. Because obviously you want to be able to speak to people and then have them put you onto other people, and you'll end up interviewing participants who you didn't even know existed through that kind of process. So you can't do it all. But my advice would be to have as much of that defined before you start as possible, because it will make your life a lot easier in the long run.
So if we're interviewing politicians or technocrats, maybe list all the different types of people that you could possibly, is that what you're saying? Not the actual name of the person.
Yeah, just say it. I think what I did was I described a research strategy. So I'm going to reach out to these types of people. This is in these fields. This is how I'm going to reach out to them, and these are the sorts of questions that I'm going to ask them. But your supervisor should be able to assist you with that.
I think you might also be quite successful if you try to interview people who are maybe not senior in a department. I think people who are still junior but have been in the department for a couple of years, or even 1 or 2 years, probably know the city policies quite well. So interview Kiara.
I also wanted to answer you, Carl. Just so you know, like I changed the phrasing of my research question slightly, and in your application you have to provide like interview guides, and that changed because of my literature review. So I mean, they didn't change completely. Just some of my questions weren't in that application, but I think that's the nature of research, and the literature review should guide those questions too. So they don't think of it as like completely black and white, but like Mike said, like, try to get your basics in.
Okay, you guys have helped me a lot.
I did. An ex-City of Cape Town official asked me to see the interview guides, and then she questioned me on whether that had been approved by ethics. And I completely panicked because I was thinking, oh my gosh, they've changed. But my supervisor like encouraged me and like told me not to worry, and yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks
Mike,
so much, guys.
Yeah, sorry. Also, just to say that doing interviews this way virtually is I mean, it is a diminished experience. It's not the same as sitting across from someone. But there are also opportunities that come out of it, and you to face. Just because the only admin it requires is like setting up a Zoom meeting over an email. So it's not. I think use that and try and get as broad a range of people as you possibly can.
Perfect. So it's almost easier for them to want to meet with you because they don't have to go anywhere and arrange with them.
So maybe on that topic, Carl, while we have you, I actually really want to organize a similar event like this, but for the urban design students from last year to maybe present their work as well. So Carl, maybe we can talk about that together because
Sure.
I think that would be useful for you as well, and maybe for other urban design students. And just for people to learn from each other's research. Like I already feel so much more enriched now after learning from what you guys have done. It's just really, yeah, encouraging.
Yeah.
And
Picked up a lot of ideas and a lot of tips from just this session.
nice. Yeah, and I think really that's the point of the Young Urbanists. And someone is asking in the chat, you know, like, how do you join Young Urbanist? And you know, there's different ways. I think being on the Facebook group is like almost enough if you just want to attend events and follow the discussions. But we also have a Young Urbanist community, which is just a group of people that is a little bit more intimate in terms of meeting and having social gatherings. So I will maybe post that link on the Young Urbanist Facebook page again, if people want to join that. It's very much for people in Cape Town, I think. But also, yeah, as a networking platform. But then we also have a steering committee, which is more the people who like run the events and organize things. And that's all done on a volunteering basis. But yeah, just contact us if you have more questions about that. Yeah, I think maybe we're all keen for dinner and feeling a bit overwhelmed and yeah, but very satisfied with all the very valuable information. Guys, yeah, really thank you for your time and doing these presentations again, hopefully less stressful than the actual examination. But yeah, and I'm looking forward to where your research can go and what you can do with it. And I'm going to put this recording on YouTube so that you can share it with people, and if they want to see what you did, and maybe future employees can see what you guys have done. I think it's quite useful in a way. It's like a virtual CV. Yeah, but if there aren't any other questions, I think I would like to say thank you and have a good evening further.
Thanks.
Thanks,
for
Thanks,
having us.
Janine.
Thanks, Kiara. Thanks, Ross, Mike. Really super interesting.
Everyone.
Bye.
Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Cheers.